All right, good morning. Welcome back. I'm Tasha Davenport, CEO of CASBO, and I'm happy to be here today, joined by Bill Schuetz, with DWK, one of our corporate partners. Bill is a shareholder at DWK, or Dannis Woliver Kelley. Sorry about that. I'm just so used to the acronyms. Thank you for joining us today, Bill. And we also have Sarah Bachez, our Chief Governmental Relations Officer, on the call again today. And as you know already, if you haven't been here before, we will be recording the session. The presentation is in the Q&A. We will be providing resources and all of this posted on our website as soon as we get the file back. So all of those logistics are out of the way. There will be a Q&A session for you at the end of the presentation, so feel free during the presentation to enter your questions. And of course, at the end, we'll get to as many of those as possible. And Sarah's done a wonderful job of making sure that those questions that don't get answered today are indeed answered going forward. So we're here today to talk about charter reform and really helping us understand how we got here, right? And all of the legislative activities around charter reform, what that means for us now, and then going forward. So no further delay, I'm going to turn it over to you, Bill. Thank you again for joining us.
So much. And Sarah, thank you, CASBO, for having me here today, and our continued partnership between Dannis Woliver Kelley and CASBO. And we really appreciate the work you do and getting through these tough times. Thank all of you who are out there in webland. This is great that we can still be here and having a conversation, even though I can't see you. What's great about it is no masks necessary. We're doing plenty of social distancing here. So with that, today we're gonna talk about some charter reform. My practice is predominantly in the area of charter school law. So this was a big deal for me and those who geek out on charter school law matters, because we haven't seen some changes like this in a really long time. I know all of you out there, we've all been dealing with the pandemic, and we knew these changes were coming. They were actually effective last January, but they didn't become operative, really in effect, until July 1st. But now they're here, and we're dealing with different issues in multiple areas. In the past, we typically seen laws come in as a part of a trailer bill, or maybe it was a law that was applicable to a school district that now was made applicable to charter schools, but not too many direct changes to the Charter School Act from the get-go. And that was different this year. The charter reform legislation is, like I said, is the biggest we've seen in a long time. So the purpose of today is really to provide an overview of the changes implemented by AB 1505 specifically, which is one of the larger bills that had the changes, with a focus on areas that may be of particular interest to you folks as business officers and staff, and kind of to help you also with planning, help you start thinking about the changes, how those will affect your district as an authorizer, or even as a potentially a new authorizer in the future. So I think it's important to understand, to help understand where we are. It's important to think about and understand how we got here. So for our discussion, I want to discuss some of the circumstances that led up to the charter reform AB 1505, including some legislative changes and some others that came out of the state charter school task force. And then we'll explore several of the areas of change that were implemented by AB 1505 in our quick window today. And I want to be clear, this is definitely a new process. It's the first time we're going through it this year. I've been going through pieces of it so far. And as we're getting into it, we're identifying new issues that we didn't read on the face when we first started reading through this and trying to understand it. And we also may be getting some regulations from the state. I know some will be coming through to revise citations to the education code, but there was also talk about some other regulations to clarify some of these issues or holes in the law. But regardless of those, we've got have these regulations in place that have timelines and other things that really are no longer in effect because of the changes to the education code. And then toward the end of the session today, we'll have a great question and answer session so we can hear from you and see what you're doing with out there. So if you could change to the road to reform. And so in this road to reform, there was a growing need for change, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Also, change in the guard. Governor Newsom was elected in November 2019. Governor Brown, had a different stance usually with charter legislation and tended to veto anything that was charter related that came through his door. He was a prior charter operator, which may have influenced that to some extent. And then we also had a governor's charter school task force that made multiple recommendations, and different areas actually became codified into the law. And so we'll talk about that. And then some of the legislative changes, these aren't all of them by far, but SB 75 addressed some equity and access issues. SB 126 addressed some transparency laws, made Brown Act, et cetera, applicable to charter schools. And then we'll talk about the task force. So in going to the growing need for change, number of years ago now, an ACLU made a report of admission practices, discipline practices that were really contrary to the law, and that they were denying admission to certain classes or disenrolling students when they shouldn't have been. And the reality is charter schools are open to all students who wish to attend. They're not supposed to discriminate, but there was some of that going on, or at least that's how it was reflected in their enrollment documents or admission documents on their website. So that identified some things that needed to be looked at. We also had a number of high profile, you've seen the headlines, a number of high profile cases out there where some bad actors in a number of charter schools dealing with some conflict of interest issues, some misappropriation of funds. Maybe the latest you've heard about is the one regarding A3, which is based out of San Diego area, where the San Diego County District Attorney indicted some leaders there, and that one's still ongoing. This was the one you may recall where families were given a certain amount of money that they could use every year for instructional activities and social media posts of using those monies to buy season passes to Disneyland and other things. Kind of brought it to the attention of the district attorney and other offices there. So these are examples of some kind of misappropriation, conflict of interest type issues, but also we have the admission and disenrollment things. You may recall the Charter School Academy from well over a decade ago now, where there was some unscrupulous behavior by their operators, taking a lot of taxpayers' dollars. And that led to some major reform now, over 13 years ago. And I just read a recent headline that there's 13 years after indictment, there's still no trial or anything going on for those people. So that one's still ongoing. But as a result, we had some big changes to the Charter School Act. We had some oversight obligations, some geographic location limitations, some things kind of address those issues. And along those lines, a number of years ago now, we had an Attorney General opinion. The request was made over 7 years ago, and in late 2018, the Attorney General opined that the Brown Act, Public Records Act, and conflict of interest laws apply to charter operators. So we had a number of these things lining up, and I think there was an outcry in some extent. It was brought to the legislature's attention about some of these abuses, and there was a real need to make some changes. And that, combined with the new governor in place, led to some of those changes. So one of those is SB 75. Now this one came about. This is a perfect example of one of those ones that, hey, where did where'd this bill of law come from? It was buried really in this education omnibus trailer bill, which, Sarah, that's like basically the cleanup bill that has tons of stuff in there. And this substance was buried in there, making a change actually to section 47605. So I think that's a great example of, how laws have kind of snuck in, and I doubt there was a lot of dialogue in committees regarding that bill, or a lot of feedback. But what this law built on, this bill built on, was the need for some change to address these equity and access issues of our admissions and discipline and disenrollment. We already had some changes to section 47605 before then, but this really explicitly, prohibited disenrolling or encouraging disenrolling or denying admission based on these specific protected classifications, including disability, socioeconomically disadvantaged, ELL, those type of things. And it prohibits charters from collecting data prior to admission, and they have to post on their website. These are your rights, and then you also have a right to submit a complaint to our authorizer if you feel we have violated that. Now, that was another surprise too, because this complaint process is there, but it really doesn't have anything more than, yes, you can submit a complaint to your authorizer and not much beyond that. So from an authorizer standpoint, we're like, okay, now what do? We investigate, but there was really no appeal process to the state, like the uniform complaint process or something like that. But I think it is a valuable tool in that it can bring to the authorizer's attention maybe some things that are going on that shouldn't be, and allow you to address those and communicate those to the charter school. So another aspect of SB 75 is it clarified some additional things you as an authorizer need to be looking at. Now, as just to refresh everyone's recollection, as an authorizer, you have certain oversight obligations. They're pretty minimal in the education code, but one of those is monitoring the fiscal condition of each charter school under your authorization. And we had a Ed Code section that really addresses that, and that it enables you to request information. And it requires the authorizer to use financial information obtained from the charter as part of that monitoring process. But AB 75 expanded that to include other information. What that other information is, it's left open, but it entails looking at other things besides just fiscal or financial information as part of your oversight function. And so I think it's another tool. It broadens that oversight, but it's also a tool for authorizers to look at. Now, I mentioned SB 126. Now, that one, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was the fastest bill to get through the legislator and ever. Maybe it was, I think, 2 months start to finish from introduction to chapter. This one was fast tracked, and they had weigh-in from both sides and got a deal. Now, this was unusual in that every year almost we've had a similar bill. Under Governor Brown, a similar bill came up at least 3 times. It was vetoed by him that many times. But we had a new change in the guard. And so with that, this one went through. It basically it clarified that the Brown Act, Public Records Act, Conflict of Interest laws, including Political Reform Act and Government Code 1090 apply to charter schools and the entities that operate those, which would mean a charter management organization, the nonprofit corporation that operates it, with a couple caveats. Now, the Brown Act, sure, it applies, but there was actually some additional things put in there about meeting locations, which vary depending on what size or what type of operator the charter is, whether it's a one charter versus multi and multiple counties. It also ensured 2-way telephone access to board meetings from every charter school site, which was really to address that access to the decision makers issue, which really what the Brown Act is all about anyways, is having transparency and accountability and having the stakeholders really be able to voice their concerns and issues. And then under Government Code 1090, where normally in a school district board context, it would prohibit an employee of the district from also being on the board and making decisions. This would allow an employee of a charter school to sit on the board, provided they abstain from any type of decision or influence or attempting to influence anything that would have any impact on them individually, which is kind of a standard under the Political Reform Act. But so it allowed for a couple caveats, and I think those were to address some of the issues of charter schools and having an interest of having their employees on the board as a stakeholder and an important part of that. So that's been the law. Really, it codified what was the Attorney General opinion with these added little caveats, but that is the law, and it's all under Ed Code 47604.1. So you often see that in charters now, is we're going to comply with the Brown Act and the conflict of interest laws as reflected in that code section. So on to, those were some of the things. So just a really touching base kind of cursory view of some of the things that led up to this charter form legislation. Two big pieces to this were AB 1505, which made sweeping changes to every level of charter school process, from new petitions, renewals, appeals, and really is getting the state out of the authorizer business, as we'll talk about more. And then another piece, which I'm not going to focus on today, which is AB 1507, which really closed up the loophole on the location of charter schools. There was an exception that allowed a charter school to operate outside the boundaries of its authorizer if it was unable to locate and had to do certain steps to prove that. But it basically closed that loophole, and now the rule is that charters have to operate within the boundaries of their authorizer. It did allow for a little bit of a grace period for those that are in the middle of a term to continue operating until they're up for renewal, and then they need to do something to come into compliance with what the law is clarified now. So I mentioned earlier this task force. Now I know, Sarah, you know it well. You were there at some of the meetings, giving input and hearing the input that was given. That task force was made up of folks from authorizers, folks from charter operators, and others. CASBO and other organizations were there. And out of that came some recommendations. Now, just in some of them, I just wanted to read what some of them are. Extend the timeline to approve or deny a petition by 30 days. Provide additional discretion when considering new charter authorization based on school enrollment saturation, as well as academic offerings and outcomes. Allow authorizers to consider fiscal impact as part of the authorization process. Limit the authorization of new charter schools to local districts with appeals process that take place at the county board only when there's an error by the district governing board. Enact a one-year moratorium on the establishment of virtual charter schools, and remove the State Board of Education from hearing appeals of charter petition denials. So think about those, and I just read them, but we'll find as we're getting into these, a lot of these were actually codified and became what is law, and the legislature did take them into account. And at first I thought this task force was going to be kind of just not really have any real effect, but it did. And the legislatures did hear them and make some of these changes that were incorporated in 1505 and 07. So 1505, big changes to the charter petition process. This slide gives you an idea of what some of those changes are to each step. As you can see, clarified that a charter petition is received by the district when it is submitted with a signed certification by a petitioner that deems the petition complete. And that starts the clock running on the petition process. So you have 60 days from receipt to have a public hearing. And for those of you who haven't been through it before, the purpose of that is for the board to hear from parents and other employees of the district about the petition. It's really just an information item to hear from the public. Then the board has to take action to approve or deny that petition within now 90 days. It used to be 60 days. So it used to be 30 days for public hearing and 60 days for action, with an additional 30 days extension could apply. So it pushed everything 30 days. But while we've gotten more time, we've actually gotten less time in other areas. One of the new requirements, if the district staff has to publish its recommendations at least 15 days prior to the meeting where the board's going to deciding whether to approve or deny. And that, I think that was to address some of the concern by charter schools about getting that too close to the board meeting and not having an opportunity to respond. But what's important is you got to take it into account now. If you're the one in charge of setting timelines and taking into account when board meetings fall through this process, this is another timeline you got to build into the whole process. And keeping in mind, you have to get these recommendations done by then. There's no waiting until 72 hours or so before the board meeting. So you're going to have to take into account board meeting schedule, holidays, heavy agendas. All those things are going to come into play on how you're going to manage this what still is a very quick process. And then at the actual board meeting where the petition is discussed, it has to be given equivalent time to the petitioners as the authorizer, potentially as a district, to speak and comment on staff's recommendations before that action is taken. So definitely some changes to the process. These are really more mechanical, but they do have some big impacts in that becomes a management issue. So as far as new petitions, the next slide, please. Now, you may be familiar with what have been the current grounds, and they still exist for denying a charter petition, including unsound education program. The charter is demonstrably unlikely to successfully implement its education program set forth in the charter. It does not contain a reasonably comprehensive description of all the 15 elements. Those are still there, but what we found in these, if you look at these, they sound a lot like what those recommendations were made from the task force. We have two new grounds for the district and board to consider and potentially deny based on. One is this community interest or impact ground. So when you're considering as a authorizer, potential authorizer, the petition, it allows you to look at what the impact is on your operations, how it's going to impact your ability to deliver the services to your students, but also is it going to really serve the interests of the population student population where that charter proposes to operate. And that's really an equity and access issue, because to the extent it's more of a really rigorous program that really isn't addressing the needs or how it's going to meet the needs of certain populations, could be English learners, low socioeconomic disadvantaged students. It needs to say how it's going to address those and flush that out. But as part of this, you can also look at the fiscal piece. Now, these two are as you'll see, very fiscal driven. So I see the business office playing a crucial part, a big part in reviewing these and potentially making findings. So that in addition to the community interest or impact ground, there's also an unable to absorb the fiscal impact ground. And that's if your district is under receivership, has a negative certification, or the county office in consultation with FICMAT certifies that approval of the petition will result in the district shifting over to a negative certification status. So definitely reliant on the business office to, pull together what's needed to analyze that and see if that's the case in both of these. Another change I didn't reflect in here is to element 7, which was requiring a reasonable comprehensive description of how the charter school would achieve a racial ethnic balance reflective of the district. That was expanded to also include a balance of special ed, English learner, and redesignated English learner students that reflects the underlying population of the district. And again, I think that was to address these equity and access issues that have been kind of underlying force through all the changes that we've seen over the past 2-3 years. And I think also reflected in that community interest impact state ground to deny, where you need to be serving everybody and you can't really impact our ability to do that. And a lot of these were, I believe, came out of some current concerns by some authorizers. I think Oakland had a big concern about the impact on their ability to deliver the services to their existing population, that it tipped everything in favor of away from them being able to do that, fiscal impact and other resources. And so I think taking it away, it gives an authorizer or district more discretion, a broader discretion to consider when deciding whether to approve or deny a charter petition. So on to charter renewal requirements. Now, these ones you may seem familiar to you because they're similar language that we have in the current education code, that renewals are governed by the same standards and criterion that apply to new charter petitions in 47605. So in that way, we looked at the same grounds for reviewing a petition as we did for our new petitions on renewal, with the caveat that, hey, those two grounds we just talked about, the community interest impact and the unable to absorb the fiscal impact grounds, don't apply to renewals. So you can still look at other things, academic performance pieces we'll talk about is the big piece, but there are other grounds that the board may consider when deciding whether or not to renew. The other thing is a charter has to include on renewal a reasonably comprehensive description of any changes in the law that have come into effect since the charter was last renewed or approved. And so that's really just update for any changes in the law. That's still in there and still applicable. Okay, so the next slide is dealing with the new academic performance categories, which is probably the biggest high profile change that came out of AB 1505 related to renewals. We now have these 3 tiers or categories. We have high, middle, and low performing charters. And the state is posting a list of charters, current existing charters, and which category they fall under on their website. And I think we posted a link to that, or included a link to that in the reference materials. But it's basically looking at the past 2 years on the dashboard and seeing where they fall. Depending on which of these categories, as the slide mentions, it dictates how many years they can be renewed for. High performing, it basically gives them up to 7 years if that's what's authorized. So they don't have to come back as often. Where on the other end of the spectrum, you have low performing. And if you have a low performing that's approved, authorized, there's interest in seeing them back maybe sooner than 5 years, because we need to make sure they're following through on the issues that were concerns 2 years ago. But in looking at the low performing, basically we're looking back at 2 years of dashboard, and if they're falling on on each of the indicators. You know, the dashboard, you guys have all seen it, it's color coded. If they're getting red or orange on all the state indicators over the past 2 years, and then some other things that they will qualify for low performing. But now we have this, hey, we had the suspension of the dashboard in 1920 because of the pandemic. So what do we do if one of the past 2 years was 1920? Well, we had a omnibus trailer bill, another one, AB 77, that addressed that and basically allows you to look back 3 years if one of those past 2 years is 1920. So, you know, that could change potentially how things go for some charters or whether they fall on that lowest performing category or not. The other one that's really important for is high performing or achieving charters, where you're also looking back at those 2 years. But in this case, you're looking at, are they in the blue or the green on all state indicators for that time period? And if they are, then they fall into that category, and it's really almost a presumption of being approved based on, at least on academic. You're not really even considering that as part of the renewal. But what I want to emphasize is, regardless of whether they've fallen on a low or high, most are going to be in the middle, so it's probably not as sensitive because we're not tying it to those 2 years. But despite where they fall on this state list, I recommend that you also review the data that's presented by them, look at the process, ensure that yes, you agree they fall within that category, so that you're confirming that designation is accurate in your opinion, because you're going to be the one, the district that's authorizing that renewal or not. And just relying on the state, while helpful, I think it's good to do the homework. And you're like, great, I got to look at another thing and analyze it. Great, I had a tool. But I think it's still important, especially with particular high achieving, where they could have a much longer renewal term. So the next slide, I mentioned what low performing is and what we're looking at, but this one is interesting in that the presumption really is denial of the renewal based on falling within that low academic performance level, unless you as authorizer make additional findings to approve it. And really, these are, hey, you need to take steps to address, and this is leading up to the renewal petition. They've been doing things to address, but they still can't cut it. And that there's clear and convincing evidence showing that they've either achieved measurable increases in at least 1 year's progress, and then some other things. So I think what's important to note is really we're looking at a non-renewal unless you can make these specific findings, and if you can't, then they shouldn't be renewed. Now, on the other side of things, you have middle performing, where I'd say probably most charters we're going to see fall within this category. Because, I mean, getting a certain color code on all state indicators for 2 years, I mean, just 1 year, one of the indicators dropping or going up could take them out of that low performing category. What's unlike the low performing, where you need to make additional findings if you intend to approve the renewal, for middle performing, you need to make additional findings if you intend to recommend denial based on academic performance. So basically, you can't deny on academic performance reason unless you're making a finding of fact that the charter has failed to meet or make sufficient progress toward meeting standards that provide a benefits to its school students, and then closures in the best interest of students, et cetera. So this is one. I know this is more from your education department side of things, but I think in any part of any petition review process or renewal process, it's a team of folks from the district who are providing input, and there is crossover, I believe, in any of these. So even though it seems more on the education side, I think it's something to be aware of for renewals for you. So we talked about, these are the new tiers for renewal tied to academic performance, but there are other reasons why a charter can be denied other than academic performance, and one of these is a new renewal denial ground. And this one applies no matter what tier, or could apply no matter what tier the charter school falls in. So it could even apply to a high achieving. So this reason for denial exists regardless of what tier they fall in. And as you can see, this is another fiscal piece, right? You may be looking at substantial fiscal factors. But also it has that equity piece that we've been talking about, and not serving all pupils who wish to attend. I mean, that's written right into the law. Charter schools have to admit all wish to attend, and they have to show how they're going to achieve a balance reflective of the district. And I've seen it come up from time to time where a charter school is not doing that, and this helps. I think it can be frustrating to authorizers to how do we get some change here, because their population isn't really reflective, and it should be a choice for everybody. So I think this gives you a tool, definitely, and this is on renewal, kind of reinforcing what the law is, and that you need to be serving all pupils who wish to attend. So again, there's a fiscal piece and equity and access piece. So if it's looking like you may be making a recommendation to deny the renewal based on this new ground, then the charter has to be provided with a notice and opportunity to cure, which is a 30 days notice and opportunity to cure is given to the charter school, and a corrective action plan needs to be provided by them. What I think it's important for you to know and think about is when we were talking about that petition process timeline and the things you need to build into that. Well, this is another thing you need to build into if it's a renewal and you're looking like you're gonna go to a recommendation based on this reason. So you have a 90-day period to take action from when it's submitted. Keep in mind you got to have this cure and opportunity, this notice and cure period built in there as well. So a lot of management, time management, and staff management. And with this one, it's going to probably pull in from everyone from all the different departments too, if you're going there. So another big sweeping change, I keep saying that, but it is sweeping, a new appeal process. Really, the state has decided we're going to get out of the authorizer business, and where before you have this process where if it's charter's denied at the district level, it goes up to the county board. If the county board denies it, then they have the ability to appeal to the state board. And I don't know what the count is, but the state has a good number of charters that they oversee. And I know it's probably been a burden for them. It's difficult to oversee charters that are located all over California when you're based in Sacramento. So this again, if you look back to that task force recommendation, no more pretty much state board taking appeals. So on appeals, say you have a denial by the district, charter has a 30-day period to seek appeal with the county board. And what's new about this one is if the charter presented to the county board has material changes, differences that are material from the petition that was submitted to the denying district below, then the county board kicks it back. They remand it back to the district for reconsideration. And I think where we've seen that come up is maybe the charter reflected some changes to address findings that the district made below to kind of make those corrections or fixes. So now that's not okay. Well, I don't think it's ever been okay, but this makes it clear that the petition shouldn't include any changes that are material, and that excludes changes based on passage of time, related to fiscal affairs, facilities arrangements which can change, changes in state law or to reflect the new chartering authority. So those would not be material. So assuming there are none of those material changes, the county board is reviewing the charter like they have in the past. It's a independent, what's referred to as a de novo review. And they're reviewing the petition as if it had been submitted to them from the start. And if the county board approves that charter, authorizes it, they become the authorizer. That's pretty much how it's been. Now, what's different here is if that county board denies the charter and the charter chooses to appeal to the state. I didn't list every single step of this because there's a step involved with the Advisory Commission of Charter Schools, making a recommendation to the state board, which has been the case as well. But what the state is looking at is whether there was an abuse of discretion by the denying district county board below. And if there was, now abuse of discretion, that's not defined in the education code. It may be in the regulations, we don't know. It is a legal term of art that's used in other contexts, which is pretty much a deferential standard where we're not going to second guess, we're going to defer pretty much to the discretion of that body below. But if there's some things that, hey, they were completely blowing the process, not following it, some other indicators, they may have a finding of abuse of discretion. And in that case, they're also kicking it back for reconsideration below. Now the state is indicating on their website that they don't anticipating having an appeal get to the state board until in the new year. And they hope to have some guidance and some training internally leading up to that. But it's definitely going to be a new one. And we're going to watching to see who goes there first and see how it plays out. One thing that I wanted to point out is if the state board reverses the decision, then it shall designate either the district or the county board as a chartering authority of that charter school. Now, this was different than before, where the state board, if they became the authorizer, they requested that the district below or the county take over the oversight functions, even though they weren't the authorizer. Now, they're saying, no, we will designate you as the authorizer because we're out of the business. Who they're going to designate? Can they force that designation? It says they shall consult with charter school, but there's nothing about consulting with the district or the county board. So this is going to be interesting how that plays out. Related to if you go to the next slide, Sarah, similarly around this currently state board of authorized charter schools who are coming up for renewal, it's always been the case that they would go back to the local district on renewal. But if the renewal was denied by the district, they could go straight to the state for their renewal, which would allow them to keep operating. What's different now, since the state is getting out of the business of authorizing, is the district reviews it, and if they deny it, renew, it goes up to the state. And the state reviews it de novo, again, independently, and if they grant that renewal, just like in that other context you mentioned, they shall designate the district or the county below as the chartering authority. So we'll see how that goes. There is a list. I think the last link in the resources page, you can access this list of all State Board of Education authorized charters and where the schedule is of when they're coming up for renewal. If there's a charter who resides locally but authorized by the state, this can help you plan now if there's a charter on the list that may be coming back to you. Since you will not be the authorizer on renewal, you're kind of at a disservice because you don't have any data or information you've been gathering as part of oversight. So thinking about needing to get that information from the State Board of Education, from CDE ahead of time to help lead up to that determination on renewal and what that recommendation is going to be. So start early. The state should be able to posting some information and giving you access this spring before that renewal, the year before that renewal is up for renewal. So another area you get to think ahead about and help with planning. I know we're coming up on timing, but this last slide, and I'm only including it because for your information, because it was another change added by 1505, and it does create a moratorium on non-classroom based charters for 2 years. And I think that my understanding of the interest in that was to allow the time for some investigation, some changes, some more regulations to address some of these kind of things got out of hand with some operators. You know, I mentioned A3 operators and some others before, and ensuring that you know, we're counting only one ADA and doing everything we're supposed to be doing. So this gives some of a reprieve for the state to be able to do that. It does allow a bit of a exception for those who are currently operating, charters who are currently operating, who are looking to come into compliance with the geographic location limitations. But this is another future planning one. I know we got a couple years, but since it's going on, as you have charters who are really out of compliance or coming up for renewal, we may be seeing them coming to you, just like to address these location limitations. So while you didn't think you had a charter, you were going to be an authorizer, you may end up being, surprisingly, and you didn't even know they were operating in your area. So it may be difficult to plan in that context, but you do your best you can. So I think that was, everyone through it. You heard all that. I know we need another breather to kind of take all that in. I think a lot of that's there for your information, but a lot of it you can't understand until you go through it once, and getting all the help you can from whether it's CASBO, whether it's your counsel, whoever, to help walk you through it, because we're in a lot of ways figuring out some of these issues as we go. And we'll see, to be determined, but I think hopefully that'll give you a good overview of what those changes are and how to start planning.
Wow, Bill, we practiced this yesterday, but I'm like, thank you for, I think that was just a really good overview, and you have a handful of questions, so I'll get through those, and then I have a few questions that got texted to me, so we'll get through this, and I think this is a good aha moment of there's, as you mentioned, all of this is new, so I think for everyone, wherever you're at, a deep breath is needed.
Right,
okay,
and
so,
as I said, it's always adding, like, you have enough on your plate already with the pandemic and all the changes you're dealing with every day with that, but you know.
So let me begin. So Bill, the first question we got is, does SB 75 also prohibit a charter school from discouraging enrollment or encouraging students to disenroll specifically because of behavior?
It does discourage students from enrolling based on behavior reasons. It was really designed to kind of, there's a certain amount of due process that has to be provided if you're going to exit a student or disenroll them for disciplinary reasons. And that needs to be laid out, but it needs to be clear that in the charter itself, and there's language that has to be in there that you can't just do that. And I think that a lot of it was to address concerns before where, hey, we're not expelling a student, we're exiting them, and not providing any type of due process or supports even before that occurred. So I do think that, yes, behavior generally, bad behavior reasons, yes.
When there is a conflict between the timelines in Ed Code and the regulations, do you use the Ed Code because it trumps the regulations? For example, the 90 days to decision for AB 1505, but 60 days or automatic renewal from regulations?
Yes, and that was one of those areas where I mentioned we need to clean up the regulation. Because the Ed Code says 90 days, that is controlling law, and that 60-day automatic, potentially automatic renewal in the regulation doesn't apply. So I don't know if we're going to see some substantive changes to that regulation, but while when you look at it, there are a couple things that seem not to conflict, but since Ed Code section controls, that's what you're looking at.
Then I'll jump to a text question I got related to renewals. Bill, what are some challenges you're seeing or hearing about regarding renewals, and are the appeals of petitions? Are you seeing any confusion or lack of clarity in the process? And if so, can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I think COVID pandemic doesn't help with the petition process or renewals right now because we're all remote. And I think in a lot of ways, authorizers were understanding what charters were going through and giving them a pass to some extent, because, hey, we're all trying to get through this crazy emergency together, and how can we support each other? But I think, we should be there, and I think that was a bigger case this last spring when renewals were up, where it had just hit and everyone was scrambling. But I think now on renewals, it's really trying to go through this, what is the new process? The time frame is the same. I think renewals has always been a good point to address issues or concerns or sew up things where the charter promised they would do it 5 years ago, and it's not really being reflected now. And to really hit home on the academic performance piece, I think that gives you a tool now where before it was more tended to be a little bit more discretionary and more wiggly on denial based on academic. But I think there's been a drive to hold charters accountable, and that this isn't okay if we're just doing it. I think as far as issues, we're dealing with those as they come. I know that there's been issues. I dealt with the changes in the petition process where you had a version of the law at the district level. When it's submitted to the county level, before it was heard by the county board, the law changed. So what are you really looking at? And I think the state is wondering, what do we look at in both of those contexts? But for renewals coming through this year, I think it should be clear what the law is that we're looking at, what the grounds are, and what the appeal process are. What happens as we're getting into it and appealing it, we'll have to cross that bridge.
And then the CDE webpage is the last link in your resource page. It says CDE AB 1505 and 1507 webpage. If you click on that, it sends you to CDE's website, and that has listed all of the state board informational memo that Bill was discussing, that has the list of all those charters and the dates when they're going to come back. Another question is it true that the signed certification pertains to new petitions only?
So good question. And there is some ambiguity there because the law states in 47605 that the standards and criteria 47605 apply. It doesn't really make sense though if you think about it on renewals because they have been in existence. And I think renewals have always been different in that you are you have had a relationship for a number of years, and you're usually working through the time period and the process of when they're going to submit, when the public hearing will occur, and the other. But in straight read of it, they still apply. All those same timelines apply, even though it's usually followed a little differently on renewals.
Under community interest, can a charter school argue that the traditional K-12 programs are ineffective, i.e. very low test scores?
And I'm not sure if that's referring to their test scores or the other, but I think what we're going to see now, what we should be seeing in charter petitions is addressing that community impact issue. I mean, we're seeing it already, knowing that that is something that authorizers are going to be looking at. So I'm not sure it's that specific fact, but it's pretty broad in a lot of ways, and we don't have any regulations interpreting really the scope of that. So we're reading it from what it says and what criterion we can look at.
If a county office of education and FICMED are now able to certify that approval of a petition will result in a negative certification status for a district, are there any requirements for the district or charter petitioners to notify the county office of ed upon the submittal of a petition?
I think the charter is going to be well aware whether that's the circumstances. If they're aware of what's going on in their district. It's pretty clear we have open meetings of whether a district's in certain financial status. And then as far as the process goes, there will be the recommendations. If that is included in the recommendations for denial, that'll be laid out in what's provided to the petitioners at least 15 days before that action. So I think it depends on your county. A lot of charters are very dialed in relationship with their counties. And then a lot of this is public information. Beyond that, it's really individual decisions.
On reflection of the district for special education, is that just a similar total percent, or also looking at the variety of disability types? For example, a district has 10.7% and the charter schools has 7.7%, but district has mild to mod at 15% and the charter is, I'm assuming, 8.5%.
So I think typically charters have a smaller student population than districts, so their overall percentage, can differ when compared to the district. But I think it is important to look at the level of students that are served by the charter, and is it reflective? I mean, that's been a concern before, along around a lot of these equity and access issues, where we do have this law in place where charters have to admit all who wish to attend, and they can't deny based on discrimination or turn away. It happens, I hopefully rarely, but ensuring that students are serving all. And I think that's been a point that I've seen in petitions of charters. We take everybody, and often explanations of why maybe we're this percentage, but those questions should be asked by the authorizer on renewal and as part of oversight as you get that information from charter schools.
So what if a district denies and then the charter school makes material changes and appeals to the county board, and the county board is notified of that problem but still approves the charter? Any recourse to the district for the district?
Well, I think the law says what it says. If it was actually, in fact, a material changes, as that's somewhat defined, then the law says you shall remand to the district for reconsideration. I mean, ultimately, if it went to the state, would they consider that abuse of discretion and send it back anyways? It's an individual call and your relationship with the county, but the law is pretty clear on that.
And so we do have a raised hand. Marlo, if you don't mind unmuting yourself. Marlo? I know you also typed in the question, but just wanted to give you an opportunity.
Able to hear me?
Yes, hello.
Oh, great. Good. Thank you. Right. So my question was a little bit about what you touched on in the last question, again, about mirroring the demographics of the district. And we do have situations, as others do as well, where it does not mirror and it doesn't, come as close as we'd like. But in fact, when we look at the applications, that they are admitting all students who want to enroll, and we've even looked at their application. We've had them look at their applications to determine whether the demographics, even with a lottery, would still lead to a similar comparison to the district. And in fact, the students who are applying don't mirror the demographics. So we've then asked them to put together a really robust outreach plan so we can see which they have, and they still, it's still not resulting in that same demographic. So what then, as an authorizer, are we required to do, or should we be doing?
Well, they need to describe in their charter right now their means to achieve a balance of special ed, English learner, redesignated, that's reflective of the population. So that's another tool you can point to. And then, there can be, you can meet with your charter. You're supposed to meet with your charters, annually for site visits, and communication is crucial to, a good relationship between charter authorizer and your charters you authorize. But having those frank conversations and getting the information, the data requests more regularly on outreach efforts and other things. I know I've heard it before, and it can be the case where they're doing everything they can reasonably, but still not having a population that's reflective. So I can see that happening, but it just depends on you, what type of benchmarks you want to have in place, getting the information so you can confirm that it is true, you are doing everything you can, and this is your current accurate enrollment reflected. You can ask for those things and get that more regularly so you can help determine if that is really the case or not.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And we have one more question, so I'll try to sneak it in. Can an authorizer, and then we'll let you go, Bill. Can an authorizer ask for any financial documents beside the state mandated for fiscal oversight, like bank statements, GL, etc.?
Yeah, you can ask for everything, and you'll see if they give you everything, but you should be entitled to any of that. And you have another Ed Code section that requires charter schools to respond to reasonable inquiries. You don't have to make a Public Records Act request for that. They just need to provide it. And if you need that to perform your oversight, sometimes you may have pushback from larger organizations that have other issues, but they're public entities, really using public dollars, so all that should be accessible. A lot of that information is also available online in different resources, like the IRS website has Form 990s from prior years, and then other nonprofit status, other things you can access from just public resources. But if you need more up-to-date things, those tend to date back a couple years, then request Form 990s. And I often will work with authorizers to build those things into MOUs with the charter of things we want to see regularly, so that you have the tools and things you need to effectively perform oversight. And even though it's something you may not look at immediately because you've got a million other things to look at, it's having that access to it when you need it and want to look at it.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. Bill has kindly provided his contact information. And so as we wrap up, I'm going to turn it over to Tasha to lead us out.
All right, thanks again, Bill. My goodness gracious, time, experience, wisdom. I feel like this is part one of part two. We're going to need a lot more information on this. And just for the audience, we are developing a charter leadership program here at CASBO. So we'll be evolving that over the next few months. But just to let you know, that is coming. We're doing that with FICMAT and some other great experts. So much more on this topic. Bill, thank you again. And thanks all for joining us. Stay healthy, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.